Good morning. Okay, we need to get this out in the open right away. For all of the younger folks in the congregation, this story has nothing to do with washing your hands before you eat, okay? It's not that kind of washing. Yes, you still have to wash your hands before breakfast and lunch and dinner and any time you eat. You still got to take a bath, still got to wash behind your ears, between your toes. We're getting some pointing action over here behind somebody's ears. That's not what the story is about. Whole different kind of understanding of washing and bathing. It's about the purity laws of the faith, not about what we do before we eat lunch. Okay? Are we good? Frederick Buechner is one of my favorite writers, one of my favorite theological writers, one of my favorite writers in any circumstance. Y'all have actually heard me quote him on many different occasions, especially when I've talked about Jacob wrestling with God at the fords of the Peniel. Very, very powerful stuff. One of the reasons I like Buechner is that he is able to take extraordinarily complex theological ideas and make them more accessible, easier to understand, and deeper at the same time. Both more accessible and deeper. And today is an example of that. Today, we of course are having a conversation about the people that we are most likely to revile in the New Testament. The people that it's easiest to dislike. The people that Buechner talks about. The Pharisees. The Pharisees. Now, what does he say about the Pharisees? Well, what does Jesus say about them? Basically, Jesus says that they are getting the point of all the extraordinary and powerful and meaningful Judaic law, that they're getting it wrong. Now think about this though. The Pharisees are devout people. The Pharisees are folks that would have never missed the rabbi's Torah study class. The Pharisees are folks that probably went and majored in religion in college. Okay? The Pharisees would never miss service. The Pharisees, if they're going to listen to music on the radio, they're going to listen solely to WLFM over in Greenville with Love from Moses. Y'all know that channel? Sorry, play on WLFJ with Love from Jesus. But the point is, the Pharisees should not be the bad guys. The Pharisees are devout. The Pharisees know the biblical story. The Pharisees attempt to basically walk the talk. So what does Buechner say about the Pharisees? Buechner says the Pharisees are good people who should have known better. Good people who should have known better. The Pharisees are us. The Pharisees are us. And that actually should be kind of a frightening idea. Because the Pharisees are people, again, that know the biblical story, that are faithful in their attendance, that give for the work of God, that do all of the right things, and yet they're getting things profoundly wrong. Why? Why are they getting it wrong? Well, consider the thing that they're confronting Jesus about today. Adherence to a portion of the dietary laws and the purification rituals. Now, that doesn't sound like something that we're going to have an issue with at all. But it's actually something far, far deeper than just what I've said. You see, at this time, probably 1,500 years, these dietary laws and these purification laws had allowed the Jewish people to establish an identity apart from the people around them, to adhere to a faith that was profoundly different from the faiths around them. To follow a single God rather than many gods. To treat one another with extraordinary respect and love. To live into what the Old Testament prophet Micah called the ways that you demonstrate your faith. To do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. All of these things were a part of who the Pharisees were. So why were they so upset about what the disciples were doing? Well, the answer's there in Jewish history. It's there in the Old Testament. They are good, faithful followers of the one God who died rather than break those laws, who allowed themselves to be tortured rather than break those laws, who adhered so much to those laws that it actually challenged the other faiths around them and the other peoples around them. It was a powerful, powerful witness. And the Pharisees are afraid that what Jesus is doing is going to set that kind of thing aside. That it's actually going to diminish the sacrifice of those who had been martyred. That it's going to take an understanding of Scripture and change it. Now, hear that. That it's going to take an understanding of Scripture, the biblical story, and change it. And they're right. It is going to change it. But it's not going to diminish in any way the sacrifices made by people in the past. Because those folks didn't make their sacrifices. They didn't put their lives and their identities on the line because of food or because of a ritual around the use of water and cleaning. They'd put all of those things on the line for faith, for an understanding of who they were and who God was. It was about more than just the external ritual. When they put themselves on the line, it's because they were being challenged by another faith. They were being challenged by another culture that was denying not just what they did, but God Himself. And there's a difference. You see, Jesus is requiring that they look closer, that they dig deeper, that they get to the heart of why they do things instead of just doing them by rote. Jesus will say repeatedly that it's actually the spirit of the law, not the letter. The spirit, not the letter. What is it about the faith that should make you different? Now, fear is a word that I used a moment ago. They adhered to this strict interpretation out of fear. You see, the Pharisees knew the 613 laws of Torah. They knew how they were supposed to behave and act in virtually every situation. They didn't have to pay attention to the circumstance. They would know what to do simply based on those rules. But it wasn't just about behavior. You see, those rules were intended to guarantee right relationship with God. And that's what they were afraid they would lose. That right relationship with God. How many of y'all have heard the phrase, the fear of God or the fear of the Lord? Okay? It has nothing to do with being afraid. It has nothing to do with being afraid. You should never be afraid of God. Never, ever be afraid of Jesus. What that phrase means actually is something called reverential awe. The awareness that God is God and we are not. That God is the creator of all that is. It's about awareness. It's about a reverential awareness. You approach God on your knees not because God is to be feared, but because God is extraordinary and marvelous and wonderful. But it's easy to get confused over things like fear. It's very easy to actually embrace the fear instead of the actual meaning. Fear is far too powerful. And fear actually gets its strength from you and I. We're the ones who give fear its power. What are you afraid of? If I hear a blood-curdling scream coming from the other end of my house, I know that it's not because of a vicious armed killer that's broken into the house. It's because my wife has seen the tiniest of spiders. Okay? What are you afraid of? And actually, what are you afraid of that has actually defined you because of the fear? What is it that you are afraid of that suddenly makes you become a different person? You know, when Jesus is talking about the various dietary laws and the purification rituals, at this point in the biblical story, they have become a part of the culture. And anytime you change things in the culture, there's fear. Anytime when you change an interpretation of Scripture, there is fear. If we look around today, this has been a summer for a lot of people filled with fear. They see something happening on the news, or they see the events determined by the Supreme Court, or they see things that seem to challenge faith, and they respond with fear. Fear is not a Christian virtue. Fear is not a Christian virtue. In fact, fear has no place within faith at all. There are lots of examples that we could give. Examples from this past summer. Examples from our own lives. Examples in particular from our culture, where we live and how we live and what we believe. But let's give ourselves a little room. Let's look back at something that we thought about one way 30 years ago, and we see perhaps a different way today. The HIV/AIDS crisis. 30 years ago, it was very easy to condemn people over the spread of HIV. 30 years ago, it was easy to point at a particular part of society. 30 years ago, it was quite easy to make judgments. But what did that actually look like? You see, the judgments that we make, it's all well and good to sort of sit in our pew and think a particular way, but what does it look like when those things get played out in the world? What do our prejudices look like when they actually get acted upon in the world? What does fear look like when it actually gets acted upon in the world? 1993, I was working as a chaplain at Spartanburg, at a Richland Memorial down in Columbia. It was after my first year at Sewanee. And you do clinical pastoral education. That's what Chris Wilkerson, our seminarian, has been doing this past summer. And one of the things that we were dealing with that summer was what at the time was called the AIDS crisis. 4 of the first 5 deaths that I would have as a hospital chaplain out of over 30 that summer were AIDS-related deaths. 4 out of the first 5. And people were afraid. Remember when Magic Johnson, had revealed that he was infected with HIV? Remember the way people reacted? Do you remember that some of his own teammates, 2 of them in fact, didn't even want to play ball with him? That he went and played anyway in the Olympic Games on the Dream Team? And that you had people in the larger world sort of panicking over the thought of coming in contact with the man? What we know now versus what we knew then. But we allow fear to define how we respond to the world. One of the chaplains at Richland Memorial, his name was Ben. And Ben was very, very outspoken on this issue. Because if you were dealing with a patient with AIDS, then you were expected to respond to the patient in a particular way. You were completely gowned. You wore latex gloves. You wore a mask. You did not touch the patient if you were unprotected. Fear determined how you responded to that person. I'm not talking about reasonable precautions. I'm talking about fear. One of the first times that I made rounds going into an ICU, it was with Chaplain Ben. We got a call from MICU, Medical Intensive Care. People just didn't come out of that particular unit on, I believe, the 5th floor of Richland Memorial in the early 1990s. We went down, and the nurse pulls us aside and says, the patient is HIV positive. He has full-blown AIDS. He's going to die. In fact, he was in the process of dying at that moment. It was a horrible way to go. And then she pointed to our gowns and our mask and the box of gloves. And Ben looked at her and smiled and shook his head. She had known that was coming because she knew Ben. But she was required to point those things out. And so we go into this young man's room. He was in his mid-20s, I believe. And he was sort of in and out of consciousness at that point, very, very shallow breathing. And Ben pulled up a chair beside his bed and sat down beside him and reached over and took his hand and held it and prayed for this young man and sat with this young man. And this young man died a short while later. But the last thing he heard were the prayers of that chaplain. And the last thing he felt was not a latex glove. It was a hand holding his hand. Jesus, in this story today, is giving us the opportunity to be good people who do indeed know better. And knowing better, understand what we should do, which is always to choose love over fear. Amen.